So I'm going to get started. So first of all, welcome back, everyone. Good morning. It's a beautiful day outside. Welcome back to our mindfulness group. So we're on week 3 this week, and we are going to go over the idea today about thinking mindfully. So this is a concept that, we'll get into a little bit more, and maybe something we've already started to think about as we've gone through. Just so everyone knows, just quickly, if you haven't gotten the handout, not that you need it today as we go along, but just if you haven't received it and want to look at it, we put the link in the chat box for you all. So I just wanted to check in and see how everyone's week was, and if anyone wanted to share a mindful moment that they had this week. And I'll go first. I think this week I've noticed that I've been feeling a bit more overwhelmed than usual. Especially with everything happening in New Brunswick, and they're starting to think about opening things. I've noticed that I've just been feeling a little bit more anxious. So when I noticed that, I stopped and I decided to take some time for me, and I put my phone away and just kind of disconnected a little bit and just took some time to really focus in and do something nice for me, and that was painting for me. So I'm just curious if anyone else wants to share a moment that they had this week of mindfulness. It's great that you're able to help your children with their anxiety and their struggles, I guess, and through things that we've been learning in our mindfulness group. So that's awesome. It's great that, that these skills, not only can they apply to us individually, they can also apply to our children, to family members, and just can give us maybe some tips and tricks to help the people in our lives who are struggling through their own stuff. If no one else wants to share a moment, that's okay. I will just kind of jump into our topic then, which again is thinking mindfully. So mindful awareness or focused attention creates changes in the brain that helps us regulate our emotions. If we want to get technical about this is, and use neuropsychology a little bit. So mindfulness helps us, it plays a role in engaging certain parts of our brain that help us actually regulate our emotions and create a sense of safety. So there are really great benefits of mindfulness that maybe we don't really realize. And we start to see the benefits of it, but we don't really know why. But that it is really because mindfulness is engaging our brain and creating new pathways in our brain that can help us emotion regulate and create that sense of safety. So this happens, and through mindfulness, we actually help all parts of our brain work together as an integrated whole. Whereas when we're overwhelmed, when we're feeling super emotional, our brain tends to separate a little bit, and we don't work as an integrated whole, but it's only certain parts that are activated and working more strongly and others are more quiet at that time. So a simple understanding of our brain can actually help us understand what's happening when we're in distress or feeling overwhelmed, and how we can respond to get certain parts of our brain to start working together again. So again, by using some of these mindfulness skills, unconsciously, you don't really realize you're doing it, but by using mindfulness, you're actually activating parts of our brain that have been shut down by our emotions. And by activating those, you're enabling your brain to work more integratively and work as a whole rather than in certain parts, if that makes sense. So mindfulness actually helps regulate our stress response. And by doing this, we've talked about this before, but it helps to strengthen that noticing or attention part of our brain in the frontal lobe. And that's how we can start thinking mindfully is our topic, of course, but also it can help us with rational thought. It can help us not give in to those kind of overwhelming emotions, or not react, I guess, and rather we respond to our emotions. So this is quite a big graphic, but we're going to go through it all, and we're going to talk through it. So I guess maybe before we jump into that, I just wanted to ask, has anyone ever been in a situation where they started acting, or they were feeling like they were out of control and acting like they were like they wouldn't normally act, and you almost feel as if you're looking at yourself from above, and you're watching yourself react to this situation, and you just can't believe that you're acting this way, and you know that you don't want to act this way, but you can't necessarily feel like you're in control of that? Has anyone felt that before? Yes. Okay. Yeah, and it's super frustrating when we feel that, right? When we notice, because it's like there's like a tiny part of our brain in the back of there that's watching ourselves from above and being like, why are you doing this? And you want to stop, but you don't, you feel so out of control, and the emotion is just, you're almost acting on impulse. You feel like you don't have control over that. So when we're not being mindful, excuse me, and we experience an overwhelming emotion, this is felt outside of our window of tolerance, which then shuts down our thinking mind, which is our frontal lobe. And when this happens, we're no longer able to regulate our emotions. So it's not your fault. And oftentimes I think people are like, well, just get it together. Like, why are you acting that way? Just control yourself. And often, yes, okay, we get it, but there's something happening in your brain that's preventing you from just having that control. And that's because your thinking brain is literally being shut down when we're feeling overwhelmed. And if we don't have those skills, I guess, in place, like mindfulness skills and emotion regulation skills, then of course we don't know how to turn that back on so that we can gain a little bit more control over how we're feeling. So we're no longer able to regulate our emotions. When your thinking brain shuts off, you can't make decisions, use moral reasoning, and you tend to not be able to be flexible in your responses. So we touched on this a little bit last time, in the sense that, you know, when we feel overwhelmed and we feel out of control, we're not able to be flexible. So that's why oftentimes when something happens that we don't expect, and we've expected a certain response and then it doesn't work out that way, we really struggle, because our thinking brain has not been turned, it's been shut down by those emotions and that stress. And so we can't think flexibly, we can't think beyond what our initial expectation was. So it prevents us from seeing other opportunities or other possibilities. So when this happens, and when this thinking brain shuts down, it actually sends a signal down to this emotional brain, or the amygdala, which is our alarm system in the brain. So this, the amygdala actually stores memories of our past experiences, and helps us know when danger is present or not present. So danger in our context now, in our society and with the way that we live, and we've touched on this before, is actually, it can be external danger, of course, we still have some of those things, but it also can be signaled by a thought or a body sensation. So when in the past, this amygdala system was really for signaling present danger, external danger, right? When we were cavemen and living with saber-toothed tigers and etc. So now, though, it's been expanded, and our sense of danger has shifted to encompass more things. So more like a thought or a body sensation, or not even nonverbal cues by somebody else. So it's really expanded. So our sense of danger has increased, which makes it so that, you know, we feel a sense of danger more often, I would say. So because of this, because it's expanded, when we start to think about a difficult time or experience, whether in the past, whether it's happened last week, last month, or 10 years ago, our amygdala has a stored memory of this, and it triggers that alarm system, and it actually signals down to our reptile brain, which is on the bottom there. And this is where your reptile brain, it actually sits at the base of your skull. Your thinking brain's kind of up here, alarm system, amygdala is kind of in the center, and then your reptilian brain's at the back. And that is the most primitive part of your brain. And it is where instinctive reactions and survival modes are stored and initiated. So when that signal goes down to the emotional brain and then goes into the reptilian brain, that kind of starts those fight, flight, or freeze responses. So this gets your adrenaline pumping, it gets your heart rate going. You might notice your breathing, it gets more shallow. So these things all make you ready to take action, right? It makes you ready to engage with that dangerous thing. But for example, if you are just having the feeling, you know, I'm not good enough, or you're feeling like you're out of control, those things are not, it's not dangerous in the inherent sense of needing to run, or needing to have your heart rate pumping, your adrenaline going, right? Like those are not, those signals or those cues that our body's responding to aren't necessarily helpful in those situations where we're just feeling that we're not good enough or that we're out of control, but yet our body still reacts that way. And this is what causes such discomfort with anxiety or panic, etc. So because your body is actually responding to danger when our danger now has shifted, but it still creates that same response. And this can actually, it's kind of a flawed system if we think about it that way, in that there really isn't, when we have those kind of self-critical thoughts, or just we're having a tough day and a tough mental day, there's no real threat truly, but thinking about that difficult thing, it still signals that part of our brain. It still activates our defense mechanism, so that fight, flight, or freeze. And this means that your body physically is reacting to these thoughts, and this causes inflammation. It can create stress, and I think we all can agree that inflammation can have some pretty intense effects on the body over time, especially if this is a system that is activated constantly. So it is pretty important to know about this whole system. And then on our right hand side, or my right hand side anyway, how mindfulness can actually help us override this system and change it up. So when I said earlier that mindfulness regulates the stress response, like I said, it does that by enhancing the noticing part of our brains in the frontal lobe. So in that thinking brain, so it engages your frontal lobe, engages your thinking brain, and it helps bring awareness to our body and to our emotions. So by doing this, we send a signal to the amygdala, or the emotional brain, to calm down. So when we're able to notice, when we start to use mindfulness skills, and we say, hey, I think someone mentioned it earlier, they noticed that they were feeling really frustrated, and feeling, they were noticing that. So that noticing part is actually your thinking brain working in that moment, and it's sending that signal down to your emotional brain to be like, okay, it's okay, I'm just going to calm down. So when you do that, and when you signal to your emotional brain, okay, I'm all right, I'm noticing that I'm frustrated, but I'm okay, then it helps to initiate our calm down response. And it actually calms us down, right? And when we're able to signal that, it causes our stressful memories to lose their strength, and our positive memories and our adaptive memories to be coded into our neural connections in the brain. So again, when we're overwhelmed, our amygdala goes to those past experiences that have been difficult, and that helps to signal, okay, this is something we've experienced before, we gotta act on it, right? But when we use mindfulness, it's coding more positive and adaptive things. It's like, okay, we've been here before, but we're breathing, we're okay. So it codes those things, so you can start to build a repertoire of positive memories, I guess, or adaptive memories into that emotional brain, so that you have more of those to turn to, rather than those kind of automatic negative memories or more maladaptive memories. So from here, once that happens, then the amygdala sends a signal down to that reptile brain, which again is responsible for survival. And this causes that fight, flight, or freeze response to turn off. And our social skills come back, our ability to think comes back online, our rest and digest system, so the parasympathetic nervous system becomes activated again, and then our whole body can kind of start to relax, and we flush out some of those stress hormones. So there really is scientifically a lot of positive benefits to mindfulness and to engaging in this process. So yeah, that's just, I find that really fascinating. It's really, I find learning about the brain really interesting. So I hope this was helpful. Does anyone have any questions about that? I know it's a lot to take in at one time, but does anyone have any questions? Or is that pretty straightforward? Okay, if anyone does at any point, just let me know in the chat. Okay. So, in talking about our brain, we have a tendency, or our brain has a bias to pick up on negative events. And that is because, again, our amygdala, or the emotional part of our brain, stores those things. So they're more readily available. So we tend to think of those things more often than we do neutral things or positive things. So we tend to notice a negative bias more often. Which, again, in the past, that's helped us survive, right? Because if we're only noticing the flowers and the bees, we may not notice the attacker or whatever trying to get us, I guess. But now, in our context, in our day and time, it also can create a lot of suffering if we don't check this and we aren't very mindful about it. So if we're constantly on that bias of negative events rather than thinking about more positive or neutral ones, then it really can create a very harmful atmosphere in your own brain. And again, mindfulness practice helps us develop those skills so that we can not be controlled by those biases anymore. So the more we practice mindfulness, the more your brain will engage all your parts of your brain instead of just that amygdala and that reptilian brain. And you're strengthening these integrative neural pathways. So every time you sit down and pay attention, so every time you practice mindfulness, or your meditation or whatever, you're really strengthening these connections in your brain, which is only going to make you more likely to be able to notice positive events than it is to have that negative bias. So I'm going to challenge everyone this week to maybe practice a longer meditation, practice more a longer like mindful breathing exercise. So just kind of start to think about, as great as you guys have been doing and practicing those mindfulness skills, just kind of think about maybe challenging yourself a little bit more, and to practice, maybe if you've been doing 5 minutes, practice 10 minutes. If you've been doing 10 minutes, practice 15 minutes. So just think about potentially increasing it if you can and if it's possible for you. That's a great example of feeling that with the street cleaners outside, instead of feeling like it's annoying and it's irritating to hear that sound. Now you're seeing the more of the benefit of it, instead of, oh, well, like they're doing a great job and they're cleaning our streets and this is a necessary thing that we do, right? So that's great. That's a great example. So we're going to go through a list of different cognitive distortions that we tend to have. So on this slide, we'll see magnification and minimization. So this means that we tend to exaggerate the importance of some events, or we might actually minimize the importance of certain events. So for example, on here, the slide, you can see one might believe that their own achievements are unimportant and that their mistakes are excessively important. Or another example would be, we magnify the achievements of others, but we minimize our own achievements. And this can lead to catastrophizing, which is seeing only the worst possible outcome of a scenario. So I want everyone to, when we go through this list, to keep tabs of how many of these you feel that you engage in. So we're going to talk about them all. So the next one is overgeneralization. So making broad interpretations from a single or few events. So say you go to a job interview and you felt really uncomfortable about it, and you kind of generalize that to being like, I'm always so awkward. Or say you made a mistake on a test. Well, I always make mistakes on tests, right? So kind of taking one situation and generalizing that to encompass you as a whole person. So our next one is personalization. So, sorry. There we go. So this is the belief that one is responsible for an event that's outside of their own control. So mom is always upset with me. She would be fine if I did more to help me. or to help her, sorry. Jumping to conclusions, so interpreting the meaning of a situation with little or no evidence. So this could include mind reading, so interpreting the thoughts and beliefs of others without adequate evidence. So this can happen often in terms of kind of assuming what people are thinking without actually asking them or knowing really what they're actually thinking. And also fortune telling. So the expectation that a situation will turn out badly without evidence to suggest that it will. So these are kind of the assumption distortions. So we assume that something's going to turn out bad, and when we're asked, well, why do you think that? We just say, well, because that's how it always is, or, well, I just think that it's going to happen that way. So the next one is emotional reasoning. So this is the assumption that our emotions reflect the way things really are. So when we feel something, we think that that is the truth or the fact of the situation. So the example here is, I feel like a bad friend, therefore I am a bad friend, or I must be a bad friend. So taking our emotions, which are valid, they're important, not to say that they're not real, but our emotions are our own, and they aren't necessarily facts, and they don't necessarily speak the truth of what's actually happening in the situation, right? It's how we feel, and that's important and that's valid. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, for example, if you're feeling sad one day, it doesn't mean that everything is bad, right? So disqualifying the positive is another one. So recognizing only the negative aspects of a situation and ignoring the positive. So again, what we talked about in terms of that, only kind of connecting to a negative bias of things rather than noticing the positive or the neutral stuff. So this could happen where you get a compliment, but you only, in a kind of feedback situation or an evaluation, but you only focus on the negative feedback that we get. So that one negative thing that somebody says, or maybe that one kind of constructive criticism that people say, we actually tend to ignore it. We focus on that and we kind of cling to that, but then we ignore all the myriad of positive things that they have said as well. Another one is the should statements. So the belief that things should be a certain way. I always signal to clients that I have, when they say the should statements, oh, I should be doing that, or I should have known what to do, or I should, right? That is a distorted belief. Well, why should things be that way? Where did that come from? And then the last one is all or nothing thinking. So thinking in absolutes, like, this always happens to me. I never succeed. Every time I try, I fail. All those things. I never do a good job on anything. So those are all of our cognitive distortions that we have. Does anyone, I guess I'm curious, like, how many of these do people identify with? Can you see that these are part of your daily dialogue that you have? Many of them, yeah. Especially mind reading, okay. And I think that's, again, I think those jumping to conclusions or the assumption ones of the mind reading, fortune telling, I think these are really common, right? Because our brain has a really amazing ability to fill in the blanks for us. I actually, I took a psychology course in my undergrad, and we were talking about a case of a woman who had a brain injury, and she lost certain capacities in her brain, and her brain was injured in certain areas, but her brain was able to adapt, and it created connections around it, which happens on a normal basis. But when we're telling a story or recalling events, sometimes our brain fills in the gaps for us, if that makes sense. And so we make assumptions because our brain wants to tell that story, right? So sometimes it creates those assumptions. It creates maybe a falsified story because our brain is filling in the gaps. I can't tell you how many times I've said something and I felt really certain about that, and I say it with conviction, and then then I think about it afterwards, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, that's not true at all. that's not actually what I meant at all. So our brain has an uncanny ability, especially if we're in a situation where we're trying to impress people, or we're at a job or whatever. Our brain has a really natural ability to kind of make assumptions solutions or to fill in the blanks of things that we might not know about, but we think we know about. Hmm. Yeah, that's a great example, Cindy, with the just using that just and minimizing the importance of yourself and no, it's just me, or oh, I just I just did this, or yeah, that just word is really I think that that signals that minimizing capacity that you have to minimize your own achievements or your own importance or your own value. I think that's a great example. Thank you for that. So this will be I think this is included, all of these distortions are included in your package that you're going to get. And I think something that is important that I'm going to challenge us all to do is over the next little bit to read through this list and maybe start to, again, use those mindfulness skills to start noticing when we start using these statements, when we start doing these things and have these distortions in our thought process. And I think, again, by doing this, by becoming more aware of when we do it and being able to catch it, we're developing that mindfulness skill, and we're enhancing the strength of our noticing brain, which is our thinking brain. And it's only going to help us notice it. And then maybe the next step after being able to notice it is counteracting it and realizing, or just noticing or realizing that you did use a distortion, and to challenge that belief and say, well, no, I don't think I'm actually ugly, or jumping to the conclusion of that. Or maybe that person doesn't think I'm ugly. Maybe they're just having a bad day and they just don't want to talk to me. Like all these different things that you can kind of come up with. So yeah, I'm going to challenge you guys to start noticing those things. And then maybe it might be surprising actually how many you notice that you're using in a day-to-day basis. Okay. So we all have times where we're more influenced by our reasoning or our logic, by our emotions, or by a combination of both our reasoning and our logic, or our emotions together. So these are actually 3 different styles of thinking that we actually have the capacity for. So our first one is our reasoning and logical self. So this way of thinking is also known as our reasonable mind. So this refers to the self we use when we're thinking logically or factually, rationally about something. When we think this way, we're not really using our emotions. We're not really taking those into account. Basically, this refers to the self we use when we're, thinking logically about something. And when we think this way, our emotions aren't involved, and if they are involved, they are quieted. And not to say that they're not present, it's either that they're being ignored, or they're just, they're not as, we don't notice them as much, or they're not as strong, I guess. So I'm curious if you can recall a situation when you've really only thought from this reasoning perspective or this logical self. And only used your logic in the situation. Is there a time in your life that you've only used logic? So Connie, I'm not sure what you mean. Maybe I just misspoke, or I'm not sure what you're meaning when you say your assumptions were right. Maybe I misspoke. Maybe we can chat about that after. So kind of going back to that reasoning or logical self. What if they're simple tasks like chores, right? You're not gonna really use a lot of emotion when you're thinking about chores. Same way as if you're thinking about your taxes or your finances. Oftentimes those are things that you're not going to really use a lot of emotion for, right? You're just going to use your reasoning, factual self, and not use emotion. So this is important, right? The skill of being able to use your reasoning and that kind of logical, rational part of your brain is really important. But only thinking in this perspective on a regular basis can lead to issues, right? So if you only think from a reasoning mind, if you only think with logic and with rationality, then you're actually ignoring how you feel. And this can lead to difficulties with managing your emotions, right? So if you're constantly pushing aside the emotions that are present when we're thinking or when we're going through life, and you're only focusing on, okay, well, I have to be rational here. And this isn't a bad thing. This is actually quite common, I think, to ignore and to maybe, I think we value in our society, we value that rationality or the logical side of our brain a lot more than we value emotional thinking. So, and again, when we're perhaps, for example, when we're at work, we need to be more logical, right? We need to think more logically and rather than thinking emotionally, because again, sometimes emotions can get the best of us and that is frowned upon, I guess, at work, unfortunately. So this is a helpful thinking style to have and to focus on our rationality and logic. But again, if this is constantly how you think and you kind of, this bleeds into every area of your life, it can really lead to problems in terms of managing our emotions. And like we've talked about before with that pressure cooker idea, if we always are thinking rationally and ignoring those feelings, then they have to go somewhere. They build and build and build, and then we tend to explode. So the opposite of our reasoning self is the emotional self. So when we're thinking from the emotional self, your emotions are really intense and they influence how we act, how we react, and we tend to kind of act on the urges that our emotions create within us. So rather than choosing how to act in our situation, we will just react based on our emotion. It's kind of like that snap judgment. Can anyone recall a time when you acted on a feeling and just kind of, you just jumped into that feeling mode and you acted, and then how did that end up for you? Did that turn out well, or did it turn out to be a problem? I can think of, and I guess this goes back to that first question that we asked, of when we feel really overwhelmed and we're acting and we're looking at ourselves kind of from above and we're like, why are we acting that way? Yeah, and acting out of anger, right? And just kind of jumping those snap judgments that we make, it actually ends up creating more of an issue for us, or maybe even I think it can also lend to feelings of shame or guilt as well, or maybe like embarrassment for how we've been acting when we kind of act on our feelings and act on impulse. It can lead to tension in interpersonal relationships. It can lead to internal problems in terms of feeling that sense of guilt or shame about our feelings and about why we acted the way that we did. So it can really lead to some problems that we have. Excuse me. So just like with your reasoning self, if you're thinking just from your emotional self and acting on these urges too often, you'll also run into problems like we just touched on. So as you can probably tell from these reflections, this is actually the self that gets used more often and actually gets us most in trouble, right? And most in situations that don't make us feel very good, when we end up only acting on our emotional impulses and our emotional self. So if we don't want to be acting from our reasoning or emotional selves all the time, what is it that is the happy medium there? What are we supposed to do? So the answer is that third mode of thinking, three, and that's using what we call our wise self or our authentic self. So this combines your reasoning and your emotions so that neither mode of thinking is influencing your action. Rather, you're able to consider the consequences of your actions, both good and bad, and subsequently act in your own best interest. So you're combining these two kind of parts of your brain, the logical side and the emotional side, and it helps you so you can think about, okay, I'm gonna logic through what's gonna happen if I act a certain way. What are the consequences, again, whether good or bad, and which one should I act on that will serve me best in this situation. So again, at work, this would be really helpful, right? Because say your boss is acting or saying something that you don't really feel comfortable with. Well, how do you get through that situation? Your emotional self is probably like, well, I'm not doing that. I don't agree with it. That's inappropriate. Whatever you want to go into the kind of like internal dialogue you would have about that. But the logical self is saying, well, I mean, this is my job. My boss is asking me to do something. I need to do it, right? So you're kind of fighting with yourself. Your reasoning self is fighting with your emotional self, and then you're kind of stuck in this internal war. And it doesn't feel good to be sitting in between that and not knowing which way to go. So your authentic self is going to be able to help you decide, okay, well, I have these feelings about it. What can I do? What's going to serve me best in this situation? If I don't act on this, what my boss is asking me to do, what if I do act on it and I still feel uncomfortable? How can I provide myself a solution to this dilemma that I'm in, and help me feel the best about what I'm doing, right? So it helps you get to that irrational part of your brain, but also it encourages you to use your emotions and have that influence your rational brain, so you come to a happy medium there. So in order to get to this wise self, you need to combine your reasoning with your emotions, and do that in a balanced way, so neither one is kind of controlling the other. And I guess maybe, again, what I just talked about, like, have you guys ever been in a situation that might have felt difficult, but you just knew what you had to do, and perhaps it wasn't the easiest thing to do or what you really wanted to do in that situation, but it was just what would become the most helpful solution or the most manageable solution? Have you ever been in situations like that or felt that way? And maybe we haven't been in a situation where we've been able to access that authentic self or that wise mind. Maybe we tend to be people who, only act on that emotional self or only are in that logical self. I'd be curious to know which of these three thinking styles that you feel you identify with the most, if any of them. Emotional? Okay. Is it, for those who are identifying more with the emotional brain, is that in particular situations, or would you say that it's all the time? Most of the time? Okay. That's a great one. Fear-based decisions. I think when there is fear associated with a decision, or we are scared of the consequences, we can tend to be more emotional rather than acting in a logical way. Home life is emotional, work life is logical. Yeah. Right. Okay. So I think, so maybe then this idea of combining these two things might sound foreign to some of us, right? We might not even really know what that would look like to be able to reason through our emotions. But again, what we're learning here with the mindfulness skills is to be able to do just that. Like we just talked about, when we're using mindfulness, then we activate certain parts of our brain that help us to think in a logical, rational way, but also think through our emotions. So I think that this topic is really interesting. It's interesting to, to hear what you guys are experiencing, for sure. So I guess maybe the next question is, can you recall a situation where you've only acted from a wise perspective, and then how did that turn out for you? Can you think of a time, where you were able to reason through those feelings and acted in a way that felt authentic to how you're feeling, but also to the reason, what was being asked of you in that situation, and the reasonable, logical side of things? I can think of someone used the idea of emails, and I think that's kind of one of those things where we are using our kind of authentic self, in the sense that maybe someone sends you an email, they might be kind of short with you or asking you to do something in maybe not the nicest way, and in that moment you're feeling really frustrated, but you know that you're not going to send them a mean email back, right? You know you're going to think about it, and you're going to be reasonable and type out a nice response back, even if maybe they, in your head, you're thinking of all the different ways that you would like to respond, maybe in a more mean way. So this is using your rational mind in the sense that, or sorry, not your rational mind, your authentic mind or your wise mind, in the sense that you're feeling a certain type of way. You know that you feel a certain type of way and you're acknowledging that, but you're acting in a reasonable way that fits the situation, right? You're not just going to go off on an email and get mad at somebody, right? Hmm. I think it's interesting. Yeah, being with children. Sometimes our kids can really trigger us. They can do things that are just, you really get under your skin or get under your, like, get on your nerves. But again, I think we can all agree that our kids aren't doing that on purpose. They're not intentionally doing things, well, maybe sometimes, but for the most part, they're not intentionally doing things to annoy us or to create us distress, right? They're being kids, and they don't necessarily have that understanding yet. So for you in that moment, you can say, I know I'm being annoyed. I know I feel annoyed. I'm feeling triggered by what they're doing, but I know that rational mind comes in too. So you're like, I'm annoyed. I don't like this. I don't like how they're talking back or how they're acting. But then your reasonable mind comes in, and it's like, okay, but they're kids. They may not understand why they're doing what they're doing. How do I act in a way that conveys that I'm frustrated, but does so in a way that is also teachable, or isn't going to like explode on the kids, right? So we use this brain, I think, that authentic self, or that wise mind. We use it often because, again, even no matter what situation you're in, whether you feel emotional about it or not, you still see that logic or that reason. But I guess maybe it's about what our actions are saying. And oftentimes, I think from what I've read in the chat, often we act on that emotional brain rather than thinking about them together. All right. So to enable our authentic self, or a wise mind, we simply have to think about the action that we're about to take, and focus your attention on that wise self. So consider what your wise self would tell you. Does your decision feel like a good one? If so, then maybe you should do it. If it doesn't feel like a good decision, then maybe you should consider other options. So again, this is a way that you can kind of hone in on using your wise mind or using your authentic self when you're trying to make a decision. So thinking about, okay, does this decision feel good for me? If I choose to take this route, do I feel good about it, or do I feel bad about it? If you feel bad about it, then maybe it's time to take a little bit more pause and think about how you want to react or how you want to respond to this situation further, because what you're choosing to do or what you think you have to do doesn't feel good. So again, that's using logic, right? You're using a logical kind of thought pattern, but you're also taking your emotions into account and noticing how certain decisions feel and don't feel. So this is a simple way to kind of use that authentic self. And again, sometimes there are things that we don't want to do, but we know are the right choice, I guess. So it's also being able to recognize that, like, that maybe we don't want to do it, and it doesn't make us feel the best to do that, but it also is kind of what we need to do in order to get ahead, or in order to get certain tasks done. Right. So oftentimes acting from this way can actually lead to, getting maybe respect from your boss, or respect from people in your workplace, or maybe even at home, even with friends, right? Gut feeling. That's a great question. I think you're That's a good question. I really don't know which I would put those under, if that would be my authentic self or my emotional self. I think it's a little bit I think I would say it's probably your authentic self, because I think your gut feeling is kind of, it's acting. I like to think of it as it's an emotion that you're feeling, and it's a signal, like an unconscious signal to you that something's happening that maybe you don't agree with, or maybe isn't right, or maybe on the opposite sense, when you get a gut feeling about a job, or maybe you're buying a home and you get a gut feeling when you walk into the house. So it could be a positive thing too. I'm displaying my negative bias here, by only thinking of it in a gut sense of, or a gut feeling for a negative event. So I think it's probably your authentic self, because I think what's happening is that you're getting that gut feeling, you're using your emotions, but it's also, I think, based on, in my perspective, a gut feeling is based on kind of like your logic as well. So yeah, that is a tricky question though, but a good one to kind of think about and talk about. I guess if you get a gut feeling, and you immediately act on it, that wouldn't necessarily be your authentic self. I think when you get a gut feeling, and you sit with it, and you kind of, yes, think about it or reflect on it and maybe what it's trying to tell you, I think that's when you're using your authentic self. But if you just kind of spontaneously act on a gut feeling, that might actually be using your emotional self, if that makes sense. Absolutely. I think when you decide to use your authentic self or your wise mind, and you decide to act on your values or to honor your values, and again, maybe you're doing so and you fear that you're going to be rejected if you act this way, or you fear that your boss might not appreciate that or might not accept that. But when you choose to do that anyway, and like you said, Cindy, you're honoring yourself, you're respecting yourself. It is really hard to do that and to make that choice, but it also feels really good in the long run. I think to continue to to put your values and the importance of what you believe in. I think that's a really, it turns into respect for yourself. And I think what we talked about earlier in terms of minimizing our experiences or minimizing ourselves, right? If we constantly are acting in a way that pleases others and honors other people's values and what they believe, then we're constantly minimizing our own values. So it does take a lot of courage to think this way and to start acting in a way that honors our authentic self. But I think it has a lot of benefits to it as well. All right. So our last topic of the day is a topic, called radical acceptance. So this means tolerating something without judging it or trying to change it. So remember that definition of mindfulness that we had early on. So we know that mindfulness is the ability to pay attention and be aware of our thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations and actions in the present moment without judging or criticizing yourself or your experience. So radical acceptance is a very important piece of mindful experiences, because if you're judging yourself, judging the way that you're doing things, or somebody else in that present moment, then you're not really paying attention to what's happening in that moment, right? If we're placing judgment on it, then we're not really being mindful or being present, present to what's happening. So in many ways, judgment is the royal road to suffering, because when you judge others, or I also want to add in maybe expectations here. When you have expectations of others, you get angry, and when you judge yourself, you get sad, and vice versa. So judgment and criticism and also expectations can lead to a lot of negative feelings. And I think that we've talked about that a little bit before. So in order to be fully mindful or present in a moment, and to be using our wise mind or our authentic self, we have to also practice being non-judgmental. So that's a big factor in mindfulness, and a big part of being mindful is to practice that sense of being non-judgmental too. So radical acceptance might sound like a difficult skill to master, but it's definitely worth the effort, in the sense that it might actually help us. Radical acceptance to me helps, I believe, with that piece of control. We talked about this last week in the sense that when we're out of control, it can be really scary and feel overwhelming. But when we use radical acceptance, it can actually help us accept things that we cannot change, right? So this is a learning. This is a theory, I guess, and it's a lot like the story of a man who's walking down a city street, or maybe even any example of us doing something, maybe and we fall through, or something bad happens from what we do. So this man walks down a city street, falls through an open manhole and into a sewer. He climbs out, looks at the hole and says, I better not do that again. Okay, and then the next day he's walking down the same street, and again, he steps into the manhole and falls down, and then he comes back out and he says, I can't believe I did that again. And then on the third day, he's about to step into the same manhole, and he suddenly remembers, okay, the past 2 days, I've fallen into this manhole, and he manages to avoid falling into it. And then on the fourth day, the man remembers and starts walking down a totally other street, different street. So this story can kind of apply to any situation, like I said, that we've experienced in our life, right? Of where we tend to do the same thing, and we expect to get different results. So when we start to use radical acceptance, we start to notice, okay, well, did this thing work for me? And if it didn't work for me, okay, well, now I have to change my approach and think of something different. So this man who walked into the manhole and fell into the hole almost 3 times before he changed his route, what do you think he continued to do after that 5th day? He chose to walk down a different street and completely avoided the problem altogether, right? So when we learn how to use radical acceptance, it will take us longer probably than 5 days, because that's a pretty simple example, I guess. It's more complicated when we're dealing with our thought processes and maybe like our feelings towards ourselves, or self-criticism, or like internal dialogues, etc. But the process of falling into those same judgmental habits or traps, or same self-critical thoughts, will happen in a very similar way, right? The more that we can notice, or we can start to bring in awareness to the fact that we fall into those traps, the more likely it is that we're going to try and change it, or take a different street, or take a different approach. So we go through this concept of accepts. So A is for activities. So sometimes the best way to give the mind a break from stress is inducing stimuli to get physically busy. So here we can call on our hobbies, chores, other activities that serve to gain attention. So playing guitar, going for a walk, organizing your closet, food shopping, playing frisbee, going painting, engaging in a workout, all those kind of things activities that help us get physically busy. So if you choose and accomplish a chore, then you're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, right? As you're effectively distracting yourself, you're also completing a necessary task at the same time. Same with playing guitar, for example. You're distracting yourself, and you're also engaging in something that makes you feel good and has a positive impact on your day and how you feel. Same with playing a sport or exercising, right? So you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. You're distracting yourself, but you're also engaging in a physical activity that's actually good for your body, right? So our next one is C for contributing. That's a weird word, I find, sorry. I stumbled over it because I felt it sounded weird coming out of my mouth. So whether you choose to volunteer your time, so this could be to a community cause, you could help a friend with something that they need help with, maybe at work or at home, maybe not in these times, I guess, might have to, this one might have to be a post-pandemic thing. You could babysit your nephews, your grandkids, your friends, kids, etc. So you're doing something productive that requires our focus, but you're also contributing to the needs of somebody else, and this can help us feel really good about ourselves. And it builds self-esteem, and this is always a good thing. So meanwhile, while you're, again, same as the activities, you're able to distract yourself, but you're also allowing yourself to calm down and kind of gain a more informed decision. So when you decide to distract yourself through volunteering or doing something for others, again, it gives you space from the choice you're trying to make or the emotions that you're feeling, and kind of puts your focus on helping or giving. And this can have a lot of positive effects on your self-esteem. So C is for the next C is for comparisons. So as human beings, we can't really help but compare ourselves to others. It's just a natural thought process that we have. We tend to do it all the time, whether we're conscious of it or not. When we're scrolling through Facebook, we're comparing ourselves. When we're watching TV, we're comparing ourselves. When we walk down the street, we're comparing ourselves. It's a constant thing that we do, and sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. But the point of this kind of just this technique, or this distraction technique, is to gain perspective by making comparisons that sometimes we need, I guess. So sometimes all we need to do is compare our own situation now to another situation where we've been considerably worse off. So to regain and this helps us regain a healthy sense of gratitude, right? So if we're in a situation like right now, for example, right, when we're in this pandemic, it really, I think it's helpful to think of how grateful we were for all the things that we got to do before. And to think about how lucky we were to roam free before and to not have the worries that we may be having now. So it's sometimes it can be helpful to make a comparison, and not to the sense of minimizing your own experiences, but just saying, right now is tough. This is a really difficult situation. And I'm so grateful for the fact that I'm so grateful for the fact that I have a home, and I have food, and I have a roof over my head. I have a place to sleep at night. Like, just kind of taking stock of the things that we're grateful for can help us distract from the distress of the current situation. So it may be actually enlightening to consider people who live in a really poor or impoverished circumstance, right? Or those who have limited access to friends and family or loved ones, and to remember how fortunate we are in comparison to those who might have less than us. So this comparison thing, again, and there's a limit to this. We don't want to do this too much and kind of, again, minimize our own feelings or minimize the severity of what we're going through. But if we can take a minute to compare our lives and the way that we're living in comparison to impoverished people and homeless people or impoverished countries, then we can kind of take stock of how lucky we are, and this can help us kind of feel a little bit better about our situation. But again, not to the point of making us feel guilty for the feelings that we're having, because it's still okay to have your feelings, but just to I guess maybe it could be worse, that kind of comment. So E is for the opposite emotions. So this is a technique that we frequently use to help get us back to or maintain a middle ground. So for example, we can listen to music that makes us happy to counterbalance the feelings of sadness. I do this all the time. I actually did this the other day, and I was going to mention this in my mindful moment, but if I'm feeling upset or not feeling the best, I will start to, listen to music, and certain melodies just really get me up and going, and it makes me feel really good. So anger may be alleviated by watching comedy or and produce laughter, right? And this can help prevent us from feeling angry. Anxiousness may be relieved by finding a calm practice like meditation, reading a spiritual book, listening to calm music, things like that. Our P is for pushing away. So this, while the other techniques give us a visualization of heading towards something, pushing away is about maintaining our ground and sending stressful thoughts away. So rather than doing something to alleviate the stress or make the stress go away, we're actually staying in ourselves and making our stressful thoughts go away. So because our mind may want to hold on to stress, and because sometimes we believe that we need it, we may employ tactics that help us compartmentalize our thoughts. So even if we put them aside and we can address them later. We may also take total control of these thoughts, write them down on a piece of paper, and then rip it up. That can be really, really helpful. You don't really know how much ripping paper feels good until you do it, and then you're like, wow, this is insane. So by doing this, we're showing, and I guess maybe in that power of ripping up a piece of paper with all of our thoughts and maybe negative feelings on it, it actually signals, I guess, metaphorically, that we have power to push away the thoughts, or to take away the thoughts that don't serve us anymore, and actually getting rid of a thought completely. So our T is for thoughts. So distracting with thoughts is a bag of tricks that we have to keep with us for emergency use. So these are our go-to thoughts that help to quickly distract our mind. So providing valuable time to process whatever you're struggling with right now in that moment and causing you stress. So this may include counting to 10, or reciting a mantra, or maybe taking those deep breaths, or maybe it's something totally different where you've come up with a little script of things that really help you. So we're almost finished, guys. The last one is that S, it's sensations. So sometimes our stress overcomes us really quickly. And when we get that physical sensation, it really snaps us out of being able to do our mental distractions, because we're physically feeling that stress. So sometimes even splashing cold water on our face, right? This is a way that can really distract us from that emotion, by using a physical sensation to get us out of that. Another thing could be a grounding rock. So holding, or any sort of item that feels really grounding for you, you can do that. And this can help bring us back to the present moment and distract our mind from maybe overwhelming thoughts that we might have. So all of these different things that we listed are ways to kind of get distracting techniques and to help us cope through difficult feelings or overwhelming feelings by distracting our mind in a helpful and productive way. So this can help us tolerate stress, act mindfully, regulate our emotions, and help us kind of maintain a sense of control and engage that rational mind, so we're able to maintain healthy interpersonal relationships and manage our stress appropriately. So in that, we are done, and I know we went over a little bit today. So thank you for sticking around. Does anyone have any questions? I know, like I said, we're over time, but if anyone has any questions before we go, I will happily answer those. Otherwise, it was really wonderful being with you again today. I hope you took something away from this, and I look forward to I look forward to all coming back next week and taking the time out of your day to do this. So enjoy your week, be mindful, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day and week.